it's kind of interesting, actually. I mean, I've always been sort of a frustrated architect. I wanted to be an architect, and somehow the calculus and physics got to me, and I ended up being a school teacher instead, and I taught in Whitehall for 20 years. But just before I graduated from Ohio State, I met some folks who lived in German Village and visited them, and absolutely fell in love with the whole concept of restoration, of the charm of the brick streets, the old houses, the things that people were beginning to do down here. I thought was really neat, and it was very intriguing to me. And so when I graduated from Ohio State in 1967, spring of 1967, I rented an apartment down here over on 6th Street and lived there for a while, for just a few months, maybe a year. And then a good friend of mine and I decided, and it's a name of somebody who's probably doing this or has already done this too, Jerry Glick, who was a very good friend of mine and a school teacher on the east side. And the two of us decided to rent an apartment out, it was in the writing club, I forget the exact name of it, but they were really beautiful, new, big apartments. We rented this 3-bedroom apartment that overlooked a ravine and so forth and so on. So,
you were Jerry Glick's roommate?
Uh-huh.
Wow, I had no idea.
And so we lived there for a year, and then I decided it was time to buy a house. And so I immediately began to look around in German Village, and contacted Virginia Welsh, who at that point in time was sort of the realtor of German Village. I don't know whether Virginia's still alive or not.
She is, and she did one of these with us.
Oh,
about a
good.
year ago.
Oh, good. I'm sure it was wonderful.
It was.
Because she had great history, and she and Jean Seifert were really the earliest realtors down here that worked in German Village and specialized in German Village. So my father had always said that your first house should be a double. And so I found a double on City Park, 1009, 1011 City Park, that faced Schiller Park. And it was partially done, but not completely done. And with some help from my dad, that was my first house. And it was great because I would live in one side of it and fix up the other side, and then move over there and fix up this first side. And of course, it then became a rental. And actually, I had that house until just 4 or 5 years ago when I sold it. And it was one of those interesting situations where I actually paid off a 30-year mortgage, and I went to Huntington National Bank, and they didn't know what to do because nobody ever paid off a mortgage, you know. But so that was the beginning, and so I lived there for a couple of years, and then bought another house and redid it, and then another, and I think I've done 14 or 15 houses in German Village at one time or another. Done extensive work one way or another, because in some of them they were total restorations, some were investment properties and rentals. But I really liked German Village for the charm of it, but I also really liked it because I was also just coming out. And I really wasn't coming out, I was still teaching school, but in my own, I was being introduced to the gay community. And German Village was a place that gay people could live and be fairly open and comfortable with their lives. And so there were numerous folks that lived in German Village, and so there was that attraction, and that would continue, well, clear until the present day. There still has a significant gay community in German Village. But in those days, it was, you know, pretty avant-garde. It was the artists. It was there was an energy down here that you couldn't find anyplace else in the city of Columbus, and so it attracted, you know, the artist community and the arts community, the people that were in theater, people that were in opera, people that were in the symphony, and then, you know, the gay community at large. And I mean, I've always said, and I make no bones about it, I'm sure there's some that maybe wouldn't agree with me on this, but German Village wouldn't have happened without the gay community.
So obviously history is a big part of your life.
I taught history.
Yeah, you taught it, you preserved the history of German Village. Where did you really see the gay community starting to make history in Columbus and in German Village?
Well, you know, it was just, there were just so many people involved down here, and I think it's because of the whole concept of redoing houses and fixing them up. I mean, Columbus isn't unique in this. You will find that in virtually every city where older areas of town have been fixed up and have had this kind of success that German Village has, the gay community has been very involved in virtually every single one of those. It's the nature of who we are. I think it's kind of a hands-on thing, doing kind of a exciting, creative kind of thing. And it's also part of the demographics. I mean, of course it's changing, but gay folks seldom had kids. So, you know, issues that were of great concern to young families, especially the school systems and things like that, and the safety and security of a neighborhood, were probably more important to folks who were raising a family than they were to a bunch of single guys who were a little more adventuresome and willing to put up with some of the stuff that you go through in a restoration kind of situation.
So what can you tell us about your involvement with the HIV/AIDS epidemic and how that affected not only the village but
Sure.
the entirety of Columbus?
Sure. You know, it was, you kind of have to really go back and think about the times. I started here in the late 60s and then did a lot in the 70s and on into the 80s and 90s. HIV really emerged in the early to mid 80s. 83, of course, was when the first reports began to come in. And German Village was impacted like any area where you had a concentration of gay men. I mean, I couldn't even list the number of folks that lived in German Village and who died of AIDS. And it really impacted all of us in lots of ways. I mean, it was very depressing. The 80s became a terribly depressing time because we were going to funerals virtually almost on a weekly basis. And my own partner, who did a number of the houses with me in the 80s, died in 1990 of HIV. His name was Steve Marquis. He was also a teacher. He taught at Columbus Alternatives. He was a Spanish teacher. So, I mean, it did impact. I mean, there were certainly a lot of the creative people were lost, and a lot of the early folks who did a lot of the early work. I mean, I think of Bob Hurry and Alan Twyman and folks like that. So it was a tough time, but we survived, you know.
How do you think the village transitioned? Did you see any major changes following the epidemic?
No, I don't think so. I think, you know, and it was people, because a lot of gay people had lived pretty openly down here. And so a lot of friends were straight folks, and they were, you know, very supportive and generally, I would say German Village was probably one of the strong areas. I think you would have found a lot of the straight community down here were involved in financially helping to support the Columbus AIDS Task Force and all of that kind of thing. So, but I'm sure it was impacted because there were just, like I say, a lot of people were gone who had done an awful lot of work down here.
I was talking with Sarah earlier, and she brought up the Berwick balls.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us anything about that?
Oh, I can tell you all sorts of things about that, but probably some of them I shouldn't. I mean, it was a major party, and it was because these were days when, see, you've got to, there's so many things that have changed. For example, when I first came out, it was illegal for two men or two women to dance together. So even the bars were different. I mean, and there were signals that would, when the vice and the police were in the bar, that to let the patrons know that there were signals, strobe lights, and various things, because it was just a different world. And so at Halloween, which has always been a fun gay celebration in many ways, I think because people could do whatever they wanted to do and act out their fantasies to some degree. And so there were several people, and one of them was Orrin Huntington, which is so sad that this wasn't, he passed away, I don't know, 5 years ago or something like that. And Orrin lived over on 5th Street, had been down here since the early 60s, and was well known in the gay community, which was much smaller then than it is today. But Orrin was a terrific guy. He had been in television, and he had been an actor in Hollywood, and had come back here and did some early television. But Orrin was sort of the brains behind the original Berwick Ball. And the idea was it would be a huge Halloween party, by invitation only, basically, because we always lived in fear of parties like that being raided. People don't understand how harassed the gay community was for many, many years, especially in the 50s and the early 60s. By the late 60s and early 70s, it was beginning to get better. But they were very protective of the party and where it was going to be, and were always very careful. And it was illegal for a man to dress in women's clothing. So you even had to be careful of that sort of thing. And it was a great party. And usually, it seems to me, it would sell out at 320 or 330 people. And it was held at the Berwick Party House, who happened to be friends of Orrin's, the family that owned it. And they always were terrific at entertaining us. And it was always on a Sunday night because they were closed on Sundays. And many people never made it to work on Monday morning, I can guarantee you. But it was great. But again, it was Orrin put it together, and all the planning and stuff was pretty much done down here. And it wasn't just costumes, there were acts. I mean, people practiced for weeks getting ready for that party to do whatever it was that they were going to do. It could be comedy, it could be serious drag, it could be anything. And it was great fun.
So I noticed we've talked a lot about what the gay men have done for the German Village community. Where were the women? Where were the lesbians? Was that a demographic that was prominent, or was it primarily gay?
Well, I think it would be, in those days, it was primarily gay men. The women's community has always been a bit more hidden. They've had economic challenges that I think that gay men did not have. And the men's and women's communities have always been very separate until the AIDS crisis. During the 80s, we saw a much coming together of the men and women's community. The women giving blood and taking care of guys that were dying and so forth. So that's a community of a mixed gay men and women has really been a more recent thing. And Columbus is pretty advanced in that. I mean, there's still many cities in the country where you really don't find the community all sort of operating together in cooperative fashion the way it is here. And I don't exactly know why Columbus is unique in that, but I think Columbus is pretty special in a lot of ways, actually. But in the early days, there may have been some gay women involved down here, but I really did not know them if they were.
Fair enough. How do you think that the gay population in German Village affected the entirety of Columbus? So, what programs or you talk about the Pride Parade, not necessarily German Village,
Sure.
but how that is kind of, how German Village has contributed.
I think German Village was really important, and I'll tell you, and here again, I've talked about this in other interviews that I've had. So we've always had this pretty open number of gay folks in the village. And of course, you get to know your neighbors. And a lot of the gay guys participated in the German Village Society. I mean, I served on the board, and God knows how many others. I mean, many of us in the 70s and 80s were really involved, and clear up until the present day. And German Village also attracted a lot of people that would become very important to the city of Columbus, in politics, in business, in the professions. And so everybody got to know everybody. And then, and you know, it's the same old thing. It's hard to hate people you know that you like. And so some of the barriers began to break down. It wasn't necessarily even talked about or anything like that. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. But there was also, remember, not really any kind of a GLBT political movement in those days. It was very small and very isolated. But what happened was AIDS changed all of that, because AIDS forced people out of the closet. AIDS required a reaction from government, from health departments, from and you couldn't hide. So many people had gotten to know each other, so we had great connections. And when we needed those connections, we used them. And so, I mean, I can go back and we can talk about the city of Columbus, Cindy Lazarus, Janet Jackson, of course, Greg Lashutka lived in German Village. We all got to know each other, and so those doors were open. And so when things began to change and we needed help, we were able to impact that. And so you built relationships with both Republicans and Democrats in Columbus. And so we've had a very, very ongoing, good relationship with city government and county government here. And I think German Village is a big part of that, because we got to know the political leaders, because we all lived down here. At some point in time, you know, they might move on and so forth, but they didn't lose those connections.
Now, what was your personal, tell us a little bit about your personal contributions to the epidemic, or your personal contributions to creating a good environment in German Village?
I don't know that...
Your involvement.
You know, out of necessity, sometimes you get involved and do things. And I mean, there were many of us that, you know, dove in to help our friends and ourselves. I mean, was it selfish? Of course it was. We were all scared to death. I think there was a point where we thought we were all going to die. I think literally in the 87, 88, I don't think, you know, there were no meds, there was no treatment. It was, the diagnosis was a death sentence. And we had a government that, you know, Ronald Reagan didn't say the word AIDS until, like, I think the last year of his presidency, which means that for 7 years government didn't react when it should have been. So we had to do it ourselves. There were no organizations. There were no, many of the regular organizations that were designed to take care of sick people were scared to death of people that were HIV. I mean, there are horror stories of people being turned away from hospitals, from even funeral homes refusing to handle people that had died of AIDS and so forth and so on. So I just, you know, in my case, there were a group of people that started the AIDS task force. I got involved as a fundraiser at some point in time. I don't even remember exactly when. And then I always felt that that nothing was going to happen until we had some political influence, and that we needed to be involved politically like anybody else. And so I got involved with the Human Rights Campaign. At that point, it was called the Human Rights Campaign Fund. And we started doing events here in '84, and have had one every year since that. And what started off as 50 or 60 people at a cocktail party now is 700-800 people at a black tie dinner every year, and was fortunate enough to be able to serve on the national board and be involved in the '90s, and have had wonderful experiences from it. But but it also came out of a bit of desperation. But it's been amazing to see the world change in the last 30 years.
And to be a part of that change, I'm sure.
Oh, it's been fun. Yeah. Yeah, you've out of tragedy sometimes comes really good things, and I think, to some degree, I think that's what's happened. I don't think that our civil rights movement would be where it is without all of the people that I call our martyrs, the people who died of HIV. I just don't think that it would have happened.
I'm curious to know, and hopefully this will be helpful in the overall theme of this particular video, but how have you seen activism change since your days, especially with the technology and Twitter and all of these movements?
Well, of course, that's all changed, but it's been to watch people change has been the really significant thing.
Do you think the word activist means something different than it did back then, in terms of? I
think it's a more acceptable term to a lot of people. I lost a lot of friends when I became politically involved. People looked at me, a lot of my friends looked at me as a radical. And so folks that had been pretty good friends really began to shy away because they looked at it as being radical. It especially impacted my friends who were Republicans, as I had been. Because what was happening very quickly was it became obvious that the future of the gay movement was going to rest primarily with the election of Democrats. And so for some reason, I've never been able to quite understand why people hold political party like almost a religion. Political parties change. If you're into history, you understand that political parties, it's just a term. It's not a philosophy. And I didn't have any trouble becoming a Democrat when I realized that the Republicans didn't like me, But it's been amazing to me how many people have resisted being able to do that. It doesn't make any sense to me, but whatever. But so a lot of those people really shied away. And what I have seen is, and it's also generational, a huge movement of the gay community to becoming more liberal, to the point where I think today we probably are as, what's the word I'm looking for? We're probably as loyal to the Democratic Party because of the way the Democratic Party has reacted to us than maybe any other constituency, maybe even including the African American community. And with that, I've watched people move, and I've watched it in myself, become much more liberal in many ways than I had been, and much more open. When you face discrimination, and when you've gone through things like we went through in the 80s and 90s, you look at life in a whole different way, and you look at other people, and compassion has a whole different meaning to it than when you've never experienced that. And so I think you've really seen a huge shift in the gay community in that respect.
There's also it seems to be a demographic shift from German Village, comparing specifically German Village and the Short North area. Do you think there's a reason for that demographic change, or?
You mean in terms of?
It's we had been talking earlier, and Sarah had mentioned that, German Village is not necessarily a neighborhood as
Right.
it used to be.
Yeah.
And now that's kind of shifted more towards the
Yeah.
short north area. Why is there a specific reason you think?
Yeah, I think when we first came down here, there were beat up, miserable, ugly, awful houses on every block. There'd be one fabulous house, and then there'd be two pieces of crap that were just sitting there waiting to be done. And the next block would be the same way, and the next block. So there was this constant challenge of, oh my God, I'd love to get a hold of that house. And so what happened was pretty much it's all been done. I mean, we're at a point now where houses are being done the second and third time. One of mine on Lozelle Street that I did back in the 80s was an old stable, and a couple of years ago it was bought, completely gutted and completely redone again. So so I think that's part of it. And also prices went up, and so it became more and more difficult. A lot of us who did this early on, I mean, I can think of people like Bob Hurry and Michael Council and Fred and Howard, and a number of others, Bob Geese. We did this, it was sort of, I mean, I was teaching school, but I was making more money fixing up houses and moving than I was teaching school. And so it was also an economic thing. But as houses became more and more done, the prices would go up, and it became more difficult to buy and fix up and make money. I think that was part of it. And then there was an element of people who were priced out. And that's what's happening in the Short North. You're seeing the rents now in the Short North are so high that I think the rents in the Short North are higher than they are down here. And so what's happening is the younger people can't afford it anymore. So they're going to find someplace else to go. I don't know where it's going to be. If I were 25 or 30, I'd probably be out, what's it called over behind Cosi? Franklinton. And the Old Town East has struggled and struggled and struggled, but I think I even get the feeling now that it's finally beginning to really take off, unless we get hit with another big economic blowout. I think I'm seeing more and more people going out there and be willing to work through the challenges that area has, because the architecture is so beautiful. There's so many really fabulous pieces of property. But as the property gets used up, then where are you going to go next? So.
Would you mind listing out the houses that you renovated in German Village?
Oh, wow.
Lived in, if you can recall.
Let me think. Okay, so 1009, 1011 City Park was my first house. And then I did 180 Reinhardt, which has now been completely redone again. And then there was a carriage house behind the Reinhardt house that is 177 Concord, which is kind of a funny story. I divided the lot. They allowed me to. It was a struggle, but they allowed me to, but the building was so fabulous. And so I went down to the city after they had allowed me to divide it, and I went down and they said, they got the maps out. And they said, well, what address do you want? And it was, there was a limit between here and here. And so we picked that 177, which was fine. And on the map, it was only in pencil, and it was Concord. And it wasn't Concord Alley, it wasn't Concord anything. And the guy said, well, that's odd. He said, usually there's something. He said, what should we call it? And I said, oh, we don't want to call it an alley. I said, let's make it Concord Place. And so he wrote it in, and it's Concord Place. And now officially, Concord is Concord Place. but that's how loosey-goosey things were in those days. It's a very different situation. So that was the next one, and that was the first German village house that Andrea Camburn lived in. People that bought it from me then sold it to her a few years later. Then I did an old grocery store at 365 East Beck Street, which was originally a tavern, and then it was one of the original Kroger supermarkets. And when I bought it, it was a boarded up Holy Roller church. And the neighbors were so happy when I had bought it because they said Sunday mornings, I mean, they said the noise was phenomenal. And that's a great house. It's a really interesting structure because I could leave it wide open. I always liked things that were wide open. So I lived there a few years and then bought what was originally a stable, but it was being used as a factory at 791 South Lozelle. It was interesting. The building was in an estate and it came on the market and they put a price on it. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was way under the market. And so, of course, they immediately had, within an hour, had like 10 offers, full price offers. So they pulled it from the market and they ended up, we all had to submit bids. So it was interesting. That's the only time I've ever been involved in anything like that. Fred and Howard, I was bidding against Fred and Howard, among other people. And I can tell you they had much deeper pockets than I. But anyway, I ended up getting the house. And so did that, and there again, that was a building that had never been a residence. And we had to jump through some hoops with the city because it's zero lot line and did an upside down house. And that was the same way with the carriage house. That was also an upside down house where the living area was on the second floor and the bedrooms were on the first. And
what kind of factory had that been? Do you know, Steve?
Well, my understanding was that at one time it had been built as a warehouse for the Salvation Army. I don't know whether that's totally accurate or not. But it was when I bought it, it was being rented by Tom Kincaid, who was the expert. My understanding was he was the expert in the state of Ohio on surface water ponds, and he would go all over with he made pumps and things to circulate the water in farm ponds. And he had his little factory down there. He was quite an eccentric guy, very interesting. He hated me in the beginning because I bought the place and he was going to have to move. He would have hated whoever it was that was going to buy it, you know. But he had the building that the Peppers have now, right across the street, 800 Lozelle, the white building that's there. That was just a one-story garage that they redid with Bill Hugas. But Tom had both that and my building, and he made these pumps.
There's been talk, I think Bob Jackson says there was a church down here that was a snake handling church. Was that by chance the Holy Roller Church that you were?
Well, you know, I don't know, but not to my knowledge. But it might have been. All I remember is that everybody said, "Oh, whew. You know, whoever they are, they're gone." But that wouldn't be shocking. So that was Lozelle, and then I was there until about 94. And then, in the meantime, I had bought. Then there was a little house that came with the Lozelle Street house. There was a house that faced 3rd Street, so I fixed that up and sold that. That was a major project too. It was so rough. And in the meantime, I had bought the house at the corner of 3rd and Sycamore on the northwest corner. It has a high porch, catty corner from the church. And I rented it. It was 3 rental units, and for a number of years, I treated it as a rental property. And then I also had a rental property on further down, a little Dutch double down on 3rd that I sold a couple of years ago. And then eventually, when I moved from Lozelle, I redid the Sycamore and 3rd house into a single, and lived there for a number of years. It's a great house.
That's the one that looks like 2 houses back to back.
And it was.
Oh, it was?
Yeah, originally it was.
And I believe the German Village Society originally had some offices
They did in the basement.
in the basement.
It's a really interesting house. Bill Hugus and I worked on that together, and to figure out how to. I usually have done pretty. I mean, I've used Bill where he's great, and he's also great at getting things to the commission. But I sort of always have had my own ideas, but when it came to the structural part of it, I needed a pro, and so Bill and I worked on that. But it was a great house, and I lived there until I moved up to Neal Avenue about 2000. I decided it was time to follow the energy and move up to the north end. And then there were 2 or 3 other houses that I did. There was one down further on Beck Street, actually outside of the village, that I restored and sold. And then there was another one on Blankner. God, I don't remember the address. That a friend of mine had lived there and passed away. And the guys that were handling the estate called me and said, "Would you be interested in the house?" And I said, "Sure." So anyway, I redid that one. I guess that's about it. There might be another 1 or 2 that I'm forgetting. I don't know. You know, over the course of a lot of years, you forget.
So, historical preservation is very important to you. Why do you think it's so important for German Village to record these kind of historic events and keep retelling the history?
Yeah, I mean, every area does have a history, and I think and we learn, from our mistakes and our successes. I think German Village has been fascinating because it's never really. Government was always behind the 8 ball in German Village. German Village people were always 5 years ahead of. We never had government help down here. This place was established, and it was successful. And then, oh my God, look, we have this wonderful thing down here. Gee, let's tell the world about it and brag about the fact. And the city of Columbus didn't do DAC down here. There were no such things as abatements. Hell, we even had trouble getting the brick streets fixed. For a long time, they wanted to pave over them. We had to fight like hell to keep them. Never forget the party at. Everything down here was a party in the early days. Literally, we made it all a party. And there we were all sitting in the middle of the street in front of Lindy's, stopping traffic and digging up the bricks and replacing the bricks to embarrass the city of Columbus to the point where they would finally step up to the plate and do stuff. And then we did the bed races and crazy stuff. But that was what made it so special, was because everybody pitched in. Everybody volunteered. I mean, for years, the first 4 or 5 years of the Pride Parade, it was always on the same day as the German Village tour. It was terrible. I was this huge conflict. The only fun thing was though, that the German Village tour would be going on Sunday, and Baton Rouge would be taking place, and here would come the convertibles filled with drag queens coming down 3rd Street on their way to the baseball diamond down there. But yeah, I mean, it became a conflict for a lot of us because of the timing of it. But it's just important that people recognize, how these things develop and how it happens. It doesn't just, it happens because of a lot of work and effort and great people and people working together. It doesn't, I think a lot of times everyone sits around and waits for government to do this stuff. And government can be helpful, but it requires people to really do it. I mean, you can't bureaucratically make a German Village happen. And the same thing has happened with Victorian Village and Italian Village in the short north. I mean, those were all things that were pioneers that went in and had the foresight and took the chance. I mean, this was a gamble. All of these I can remember doing the Reinhardt House. I went to, I think it was State Savings, or I don't know. There was the president was an old German who still spoke with a heavy German accent. He was on the German Village Board. And so I thought, well, I'll go there about alone. And he came out and he looked at the house and he said, "Oh, that house isn't worth that," and walked away. That was the end of my loan application. And this was a guy that was on the board of German Village. Of course, it turned out that was the house that the carriage house sat on, and at that point in time, when I probably made more money on that piece of property than, he was completely wrong, but it was a risk. And I can remember my father coming up, and I mean, he was very helpful and supportive, but he shook his head. He said, "Oh my God, do you really know what you're getting into?" on a couple of these projects. But I don't know, you approach them, and when you're younger, you assume it's going to work. And it did. It did.
Steve, can you recall for Aaron any particular incidences in the early days of either the gays and the straights down here having a particularly good relationship, or any times when there were maybe some friction?
I don't remember any friction. I honestly don't ever remember any friction. I never witnessed it myself. Maybe others did, but no. I mean, I'm sure there were people that probably rolled their eyes, and there were some that probably avoided us. But generally speaking, I never found any hostility among the folks that lived down here. If there was any, it would have been from some of the old timers who had been here before anything was going on, and there might have been some resentment of that. I don't know, but I don't remember anything.
I remember Bill Linke telling me that even though only one of him and his partner David, was it? Can't remember.
Yeah.
Only one of them could join the society because it would look too odd if both joined the society. But that they had wonderful friends, straight friends around Concord there at the time. And I think his partner was a pharmacist.
Mm-hmm.
And in the winter, when the roads were really bad, the streets were bad, nobody could get out, they would exchange food with each other. And his partner would bring prescriptions down for the old ladies who lived in the neighborhood, and they just got along fabulously.
I think, I think the reluctance, because Steve and I were in a similar situation, and I think the first house or two that we had on tour, I think only my name was on. Well, I take that back. I guess when we were also in the newspaper, and when the newspaper article came out, how they do that the Sunday before the tour, I think the Reinhardt House and maybe the Concord House, only my name was used, and my name was technically the owner. We were, in those days you didn't have dual owners of much of anything. It was almost impossible. But I think a lot of that hesitation was because we were fearful of the repercussions, and especially with Steve and me, because we were both school teachers. So, and whether our names were on the ticket together, I don't know. I mean, at some point, I know we said, "Screw this. We're not playing that game anymore." But I do know in the first couple that would have been in the 70s. You were just scared. You were hiding. There were people. I had good friends that I was very careful about where I would be seen with them, because they were pretty flamboyant, and so we were careful about where we would go to dinner with them, because they were obvious, and we didn't want to have that guilt by association because we could be fired. Of course, there's still a lot of people that can be fired. People don't realize that. Other than the city of Columbus and a couple of the suburbs, just recently Bexley and maybe Dublin, maybe Arlington, but in most places you can still be fired because you're gay. You can get married today, it can be in the paper that you got married, and then you can be fired for your job the next day because you're gay. So we're still fighting those battles. We have a long way to go yet.
I asked you a while back on the phone, and I was wondering if you would tell Aaron a little bit about Bob Hurry and his impact on them.
Sure, Bob Hurry is, he's one of the nicest, most creative, talented men I ever met in my life. And he did that little area at Grant and Beck that's known as Hurryville, which to a lot of us, we admired his work, but that was pretty far east because, you kind of hung out close to 3rd Street, and Bob was doing all of his work down there, but he did all the work himself, and he was a craftsman. Retired from, was it IBM or something?
He was a geophysicist in Texas.
That's it. There were oil stuff. And, but he was, he just sort of was over there in his own little world, and he would pick up another property and another one and another one. And I don't know how many different buildings he did over there, but it was a considerable number. And they were all done much more, there was a much more of a Williamsburg kind of influence in those houses. And I think he could get by with it because they were, so many of them back on alleys, and they were little cottages and garages and things like that. So, but he was great, and he did beautiful work. Oh my God, the woodwork on the inside, and beautiful, the doors and the shelving units, and did all of it himself.
And he came to influence other people.
Oh my, yes.
Writings and so forth.
Yeah. It was always beautiful. And I luckily got to know he and Alan early on. In fact, Alan, his partner, was a good friend. His parents were good friends of my stepmother. And he was originally from Dayton, as I was. And then when we lived on Beck Street, we were right there, almost catty corner from. Actually, that Beck Street house is actually outside the village. I think it's the only house that's ever been on tour that is technically outside the village. But
how did business leaders kind of pave the way? Did gay couples struggle with opening businesses in the village? Was there any kind of, especially Fred and Howard, I watched that earlier today, and it was just amazing how much support they got. What kind of interaction did gay business leaders have in the village?
They're
still have today?
Yeah. Well, German Village really doesn't have much business, if you think about it. I always felt, and Fred and Howard and I were on different sides on this issue, but I always felt that German Village should have expanded to take in South High Street, and then we could have had a short south. You have no idea the beautiful buildings and houses that sat on South High Street that are gone, that became parking lots or became office buildings or became this, that, and the other thing. Oh, those 4 houses, I looked at those. They were for sale, and oh my God, they were beautiful. It was like a compound. It was like, there were at least 3 and maybe 4, and they were beautiful with bay windows. It almost looked more like Victorian Village than German Village. They had big bay windows and beautiful, and it was just, today it wouldn't be very much money, but in those days it looked like a lot of money. And we just couldn't figure out how to make it happen. And the next thing we knew, of course, McDonald's came in and the buildings were gone. And but you don't realize the prices. I don't know whether I was still living on City Park. It had to be 69, 70, somewhere in that vicinity. One of the big houses on Deschler came up, the one with the big square tower. You sort of enter and there's this huge tower that goes up to a peak in the corner. It's right in the middle, kind of in the middle of Deschler. It was $35,000. And I was probably making teaching school, I don't know, $6,000 a year or something. That was a lot of money. And all I could think of was I'd look up at the eaves and all of the fancy work that was on that building, and I'd think, this house will eat me. It'll just eat me alive. I cannot afford this house. And so I had to pass on it. But of course, a mistake in its own way. But yeah, so you went through things like that. But there aren't that many businesses down here. So you've had over the years a number of gay folks who have been in the hair business, and good ones, and open, very open. Dennis Cox was down here early. He had the little shop there. I think it's still a hair salon across from right down here on 3rd, next to the parking lot for what's the bakery across the street?
Okay, you're talking about Max Salon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dennis Cox was in there for years. And Jacob Neal was down here for a long time. But there really aren't very many businesses, a few shops. And there used to be a few antique shops that are gone now. Where the bookstore is, the Book Loft, of course, that's gay owned. And then across from that was another little shopping mall. It's now offices.
Where Book Loft is?
Across the street, across City Park.
World Bazaar.
The World Bazaar. The World Bazaar. And John Surratt had his antique shop right there on City Park. No, I take that back. It wasn't John. It was... Huh? Isn't that awful?
I probably know it too.
Big, tall, he's still decorating in town. I may think of it yet, but he had his shop there, and then there were other little shops in there. Unfortunately, the business has been tough. I think it's hard to make these little businesses go.